There's Nate.
Yep.
There's Rita. There's Schmidt. Okay. They're all right there. Now, let's turn it around. And hopefully you can still see me. Okay. Cool. Okay. I want to talk to you today about global climate change and the reality of it and some of the things we can do to change it. 33 billion metric tons of CO2 per year are released into the atmosphere from humans burning fossil fuels. The CO2 in our atmosphere hit 400 parts per million as recently as last May. And it hasn't been that high since modern humans existed. Before the Industrial Revolution, it was 280 parts per million. CO2, as many of you probably know, is a greenhouse gas. As it accumulates in the atmosphere, it traps heat on the Earth. And over time, because of that, the Earth gets hotter and hotter. The effects and extent of this right now are uncertain. Extreme weather in the form of hurricanes, fires, and floods is likely. And the worst case scenario would be that if the Earth reached a tipping point in which it just continued to get hotter and it was irreversible. To fix this, different proposals have been put forth. Some have offered a cap-and-trade system that's popular among politicians. I will be talking about a carbon tax, and I'll also be talking about some renewable energy sources that will hopefully be able to better compete because of the carbon tax. So, a couple reasons we can believe that we can trust that the Earth is being affected by human use of fossil fuels is because of the major scientific institutions and the majority of scientists who support this idea. The National Association of Science is one such institution, and the American Association for the Advancement of Science is the world's largest and most prestigious scientific society, which also supports this idea. Alan Leshner, the chief executive officer of the AAAS and publisher of the academic journal Science, says the vast preponderance of evidence based on years of research conducted by a wide array of different investigators at many institutions clearly indicates the global climate change is real, is caused largely by human activities, and the need to take action is urgent. We also have, you're probably aware there are some climate change deniers, but one interesting thing is that trend the trend is that people who are changing their minds come from the deniers and come from the skeptics, whereas you don't see the opposite happening. You don't see very much people who used to believe in global warming but are now dismissing it. An article in Reason magazine from November 2012 highlights this with the example of physicist Richard Mueller. He used to be a skeptic, but he has come to believe it is real and caused by humans. And quote Reason magazine saying, tellingly, climate change conversions all seem to go in one direction, as previously stated. Now I'd like to move on to talk about some of the solutions. A carbon tax. I'd like to bring up Jonathan Adler, who is a professor at the Case Western Reserve University School of Law. In the Atlantic article, May 30, 2012, it discusses him. He explains that even skeptical estimates of the impact of climate change will bring a 5 to 11 inch in sea level rise over the next century due to human causes. And while maybe this will be manageable for wealthy nations, it will be harder on poorer nations. This means that the effects of climate change have what is called a negative externality, meaning there are costs involved in polluting, which causes this climate change, which then it bears a cost to people that aren't gaining that income from it. So if a company pollutes so much, if all our companies in Western nations pollute so much, then some of these poorer regions are going to be affected. The effects that happen to them aren't being taken into account. And a carbon tax is one way to try and make that more fair. And Jonathan Adler from the Atlantic article discusses common law, which is a convention in the American Anglo traditions, where he says, if person A floods the property of person B, then person A should compensate. And he says that even non-catastrophic global warming would create property rights violations such as flooding. He believes that a neutral carbon tax is the best way to go. It's a simple tax with a flat rate of something like, starting low, maybe $3 a ton, and over time increasing. A carbon tax is more transparent than cap and trade schemes and other efforts to curb carbon emissions. It's less vulnerable to mischief, and it involves limited government, so it should appeal to conservatives and libertarians who are normally skeptical of government intervention. It also helps level the playing field and helps the markets work the way they should. In the Christian Science Monitor article in January 2013, Paul Boudreau says that economists have convinced environmentalists that community market systems are better than inflexible commands. And the carbon tax works with that community market system. And a August 31st New York Times article had a panel of 41 prominent economists, and 90% of them agreed that a tax on the carbon content of fuels would be a less expensive way to reduce carbon emissions than would a collection of policies such as corporate average fuel economy requirements for automobiles. With this carbon tax, perhaps other renewable energies will have a better chance. There has been, as we have had the growth of renewable energies starting to come to life, unfortunately also the growth of fossil fuels has happened simultaneously. But the rapid growth of renewables, according to IEA Executive Director Maria van der Hoven, says the rapid growth of renewables continues to beat expectations and is a bright spot in an otherwise bleak assessment of global progress towards a cleaner and more diversified energy matrix. And let's just go through some of those renewable resources briefly, and some of the promises they hold. The June 2013 article in Scientific American says that in Brazil, Turkey, and New Zealand, wind now competes with fossil fuel power plants. So we have one example of wind in this one economy in New Zealand is actually being able to compete, so that gives us some hope. Let me talk about solar energy for a minute.
Yeah.
Barry Pittock outlines some of these ideas in his book, Climate Change, the Science, Impacts, and Solutions. The energy that reaches us, that reaches the Earth from the sun, is 10,000 times what the globe uses per year. If we had the technology to harness that energy, we would only need a desert a few hundred kilometers each side. Currently, only 0.2% of energy production comes from solar. One of the problems with solar energy like this is it comes from such a remote location, it's hard to transfer that energy, and we might need a new energy grid. But new high voltage direct current cables and larger storage abilities are starting to solve that problem. NanoSolar is a company which has made commercial quantities of solar cells printed with solar absorbing nano ink at a tenth the cost of earlier panels, competitive with fossil fuels. That is from Barry Pittock's book I mentioned earlier. Another biomass is another hopeful alternative to coal and fossil fuels. Swansea University scientists say on BBC.com on October 15th, 2013, that algae, especially microalgae, is ideally suited to turning into an oil which can then be turned into either aviation fuel for airplanes or biodiesel to power our cars. And another interesting fact is that 4 years ago, a U.S. airliner completed the first test flight on a plane partly powered by biofuel derived from algae. Geothermal fuel is one more alternative I'll just mention. It's interesting that the top 2 kilometers of the Earth's crust could supply America at the 2009 rates for 30,000 years. So you see that there's definitely some alternatives to burning fossil fuels, and if we can just find ways to find those and develop the technologies, then it is possible to meet our energy needs with them. A carbon tax is a way to help level the playing field, and it takes into account the environmental costs of pollution not otherwise addressed, and hopefully, depending on how it's implemented, some of the money from the carbon taxes could also be used to fund some of these renewables. So there's some things for you to think about. Thank you for listening.
Let me ask you, I'm clapping. Yay!
Yay.
I want to ask you a question anyway.
Okay, but I have to show my audience now. Here.
Okay. Hello.
There's Nate.
So we do the question session now?
Yeah.
Do you want to do it on camera or off camera?